everyone. Welcome. Bienvenidos a todos. It's so good to see everyone back for our wonderful Sephardic Digital Academy. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ethan Marcus. I'm the Managing Director of the Sephardic Jewish Brotherhood of America, the national umbrella organization for the Ladino-speaking Sephardic community of the United States. We're so excited to have you for our new three-part series on Turkish synagogues and the politics of conservation with our dear friend Kenan Cruz Çelik. I'm sorry I'm the pronunciation of the last name wrong. Please forgive me and my poor Turkish language skills. Just as a reminder, this program is through our wonderful Sephardic Digital Academy, a host of online educational resources, kind of a one-stop shop for everything Sephardic in the United States. So if you're interested in learning more about Sephardic history, culture, Ladino language, food, Sephardic Torah perspectives, and more, please go and check out our website at SephardicBrotherhood.com/Sephardic Digital Academy. So a little bit about our speaker today. Kenan is a Turkish-Portuguese graduate student of modern Middle East studies at the University of Oxford. He's interested in politics, travel, cultural heritage, history, and languages, among other things. And recently started a blog to discuss his passions for writing and photography. He's written in various works on languages. He's been published in several platforms, including Haaretz, Correo International, Hablaremos, Shalom Gazeti, and Elemana Ser. He's also a student himself of Ladino and has been working very hard to help with the preservation of Ladino language and culture, as well as the preservation of historic Jewish sites in Turkey. Without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to Kenan to begin the program.
Yes, hello everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Let me quickly just share my slides with you all. Just a second. There we go. All right, just a second. All right, so hello, welcome, bienvenidos, bienvenidas, hoş geldiniz to everyone all over the world. Thank you so much for tuning into this lecture series, and thank you to the Hermandad Sephardi and to Ethan for your invitation and your warm introduction. I was going to introduce myself briefly, but I see that Ethan already gave me a wonderful introduction, so I'm going to skip through that bit. But I do want to talk a little bit about El Amanecer, which is the Sephardic newspaper that I write for, based in Istanbul. It is the only Ladino newspaper in the world that is still published once a month. It's a supplement of the weekly Turkish Jewish newspaper Shalom, and I've been writing in it for over a year now. Just wanted to bring that up. So I'll move on to the series outline. Here's a brief outline of the topics I'll be covering over the next weeks. Today I'm going to be starting with shining new lights on Istanbul's Ashkenazi heritage, and I'll be talking about giving a brief historical context on the history of Jews in the Ottoman Empire and the Ashkenazi history of Istanbul more specifically, before talking about the neighborhood of Galata and critically analyzing the conservation practices surrounding the three Ashkenazi synagogues of Galata. This week's presentation is based on an article I wrote 2 years ago that is available on my blog. Next week, I'll be delving into the recent state-led synagogue restoration projects in Turkey, looking at how the Turkish state has instrumentalized the conservation and heritagization of non-Muslim sites based on self-serving national and international political considerations. I'll be providing a critique of understandings of the term tolerance and questioning whether the state-led conservation of Armenian, Jewish, and Greek sites in Turkey does in fact facilitate the development of a more critical understanding of Turkish history with the good, the bad, and the ugly. And finally, in week 3, I'll be looking at the major conservation project underway in Izmir, in its former Jewish neighborhood, or Juderia, as it's called in Ladino, of Kemeraltı, where there are around 9 synagogues that are back-to-back and located in very close proximity to one another. I'll be comparing the status of Izmir's Juderia and its synagogues to the status of Istanbul's former Juderias of Hasköy and Balat. So before I start, I want to talk about some useful sources that came in handy while preparing for this lecture series, and more specifically for today's topic. Unfortunately, I can't go over every single article and book that I've read while researching these topics, but I wanted to mention some of the key books and some of the authors that are really experts in the field. In the weeks to come, I'll be sure to add a few additional book recommendations, and if anyone would like a more comprehensive bibliography, please feel free to contact me via email, and I'll be more than happy to provide you with one. So Streets of Memory, starting here, by Amy Mills, is a great book that looks into the Istanbul neighborhood of Kuzguncuk, which once had a large Jewish population, and it explores themes of urban renewal, tolerance, and multiculturalism in the neighborhood. Istanbul, City of Difference, edited by Nora Fischer-Onar, is an excellent collection of articles that provides a strong framework for understanding today's Istanbul and its notions of diversity, cosmopolitanism, and difference. Sacred Precincts has a great article in it by Meltem Özkan Altınöz about the Jewish architecture in Istanbul following the Tanzimat reforms. I read this article during my undergraduate degree, and it inspired me to write the article on which I am basing today's presentation. So thank you to Meltem. The next book suggestions are all by Rıfat Bali. Bali is an excellent Turkish Jewish historian who has produced numerous books and written many articles on Ottoman and Turkish Jewry, bringing a critical perspective to the previously established historiography on the topic. Another Turkish Jewish historian, Naim Güleryüz, down here, it has also written fantastic books on Ottoman and Turkish Jewish history. His book on the Synagogues of Istanbul, which I think is available just in Turkish, was particularly helpful in the preparation for this week's presentation. Up here, this booklet on the Ashkenazi heritage of Turkey and Ashkenazim in Turkey is distributed for free by the Schneider Temple Art Center in Istanbul, in Galata. It's also available online, and it's full of many interesting facts and pictures. I suggest you all acquire it. I can also send a link to whoever is interested. Next, there is Yahudilerin İstanbul'u, which is by Okshan Svastiks. I think it's only available in Turkish, unfortunately, but it's one of the best sources that documents contemporary Jewish heritage in Turkey and in Istanbul specifically, not just looking at synagogues, but also buildings, schools, and much more. Jewish Life in the 21st Century, in 21st Century Turkey by Marci Brinkdanan is also a seminal work for those of you interested in an account on contemporary Jewish life in Turkey from a critical perspective. And finally, last but not least, Roysi Ojavo Kamayor's book, Turkey's Jewish Heritage Revisited, is a must-read for anyone who is interested in contemporary conservation efforts, specifically in terms of Jewish cultural heritage projects in Turkey. So moving on to a summary, the presentation outline for this week. First, I'll begin by talking about the history a little bit. I'm going to look at the non-Muslim architectural heritage in the Ottoman Empire. I'm going to give a historical summary of the 19th century and the Tanzimat reforms and the impact that these reforms had on Turkey's churches and synagogues. Later, I'll move on to the neighborhood of Galata and talk about the Jewish heritage in the area, while also providing some historical context on the Ashkenazi community of the city. Finally, I'll move on to today's case study, the three Ashkenazi synagogues of Galata and their hugely differing present-day conditions. Here I'll also discuss the forces that inform conservation, comparing the current statuses of these three synagogues. So, in the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire went through a series of social and political reforms following a period of territorial decline and economic crisis. The rise of nationalist and secessionist movements throughout the empire compelled the Ottomans to usher in a period of reforms known as the Tanzimat. This tumultuous political setting accelerated the development and proliferation of several ideological movements that aimed to halt the disintegration of the empire and reinstitute territorial and demographic stability. Among these ideologies, the ideology of Ottomanism was one of the most salient and had a profound influence on the Ottoman Empire in a number of fields. Ottomanist ideology, which conceived the redefinition of the Ottoman Empire as a state in which all citizens were equal before the law, sought to introduce civic nationalism as a uniting factor to bring different subjects of the Sultan together regardless of ethno-religious identity. The reform edicts of this period, the Tanzimat in 1939 and the Islahat in 1856, sought to enshrine this egalitarianism into law and practice. These reforms purportedly ensured equality before the law for all Ottoman citizens, granting non-Muslims social, political, and civic rights that were previously available exclusively to members of the Muslim millet. So this is an interesting quote that sort of explains the regime before the reforms of the Tanzimat period. The system in place beforehand was quite rigorous and strict, and I'll just read the quote for you. The millet system was based on the principle that Muslims constituted the dominant religious community of the empire, while non-Muslims were given protection to exercise their religion and govern themselves in exchange for special taxation. To enforce this arrangement, an extensive set of codes regulated the sections of the city in which each group could live, the color of their clothing, and the style and the height of their buildings. For example, Armenians were directed to wear red and violet, Greeks to wear black, and Jews to wear blue, while Muslims wore green. So as mentioned, the reforms of the 19th century saw the overhaul of the strict regulation of discriminatory legal, architectural, and sartorial practices that were previously imposed on non-Muslim Ottomans. Non-Muslim houses of worship that could previously only be built with special permission and that were formerly subject to various architectural restrictions based on visibility and height no longer had to deal with these restrictions. Churches and synagogues were for the first time allowed to be built higher than mosques that were in the perimeter, and the construction of domes and belfries was now permitted. So here is an example of a late Ottoman era project that truly encapsulates the ideology of Ottomanism. Located in the neighborhood of Shishli, the Darul Ajazeh is a so-called poorhouse or a hospice and care home for the needy. It was opened in 1895 during the rule of Abdulhamid II and was imagined as a space where all Ottoman citizens could come and receive equal treatment and care regardless of religious or ethnic background. What's interesting about the Darul Ajazeh is that within its grounds, a masjid, a chapel, and a synagogue were constructed side by side. In fact, as you see here, the synagogue and chapel, synagogue is right here, the entrance to the chapel is just here, are in the same building. The synagogue and the chapel happen to share the same building, while the masjid is just across. This is something similar to what we see under construction nowadays in cities such as Berlin and Abu Dhabi. So here is a picture of the chapel from the inside. It was restored a few years ago, if I'm not mistaken. Same with the synagogue. Another major change, so similarly, as a result of the Tanzimat reforms, we can see that late 19th century and early 20th century Ottoman church and synagogue architecture clearly reflects this shift in policy. Newly constructed churches and synagogues from this period were no longer hidden from sight, but rather became important and visible parts of the urban fabric. In this sense, churches and synagogues were permitted to display symbols pertaining to Christianity and Judaism on their front facades, and overall there was a shift to a politics of visibility in the public sphere as equal citizens of the empire. Another major change in Ottoman synagogue architecture occurred within this period. As Professor İnci Türkoğlu writes in her doctoral thesis on Ottoman and Turkish synagogue architecture, synagogues built after the Tanzimat period bore a more Western and more European basilical architectural form. In this typology, the bima, or the teva, as it's referred to by Sephardim, I believe, which would have previously been located at the center of the synagogue, was moved to the front of the building next to the Torah ark. This allowed for more space in the synagogue, providing a much greater capacity for worshippers to congregate. So here are some examples of churches and synagogues from this period. So St. George Cathedral in Fener is from before the Tanzimat reforms. It's very evident in its architecture. As you can see, it doesn't have a dome, doesn't have a church tower, doesn't have a belfry, and it has a very unassuming, rather plain facade, despite being the seat of the Greek Orthodox Patriarchate of Constantinople. In comparison, here is the Hagia Triada Greek Orthodox Church, which was built in 1880 in Beyoğlu. It's one of the first churches in Istanbul to be constructed following the reform edicts. It was opened in 1880, and its massive dome and twin bell towers clearly indicate that it was constructed in the spirit of the Ottomanist reforms. The church is the largest Greek Orthodox church in the city, and today it is clearly visible from Taksim Square. In terms of synagogues, here are two examples from elsewhere in the empire. The Ma'alem synagogue in Hasköy, as you can see from the outside, you can barely see a thing. It's just surrounded by very high walls. Of course, there's a little Hebrew inscription here, but other than that, the synagogue building itself is virtually invisible is virtually hidden from the public sphere and from the public eye. However, on the right, you can see the interior, which is not the basilical form, so it is a pre-Tanzimat synagogue, as the bima, the teva, is in the middle, and it's shaped very much like a traditional Sephardic synagogue of the Ottoman Empire. Let's compare it to the Bet Israel synagogue in Izmir. I see some smiling faces. The Bet Israel synagogue in Izmir was built post-reform, and it's a perfect example of post-reform Ottoman Jewish architecture. It was built in 1907 and features a grand facade that clearly faces the street. It's adorned with a large Star of David, as well as a large dome, which would have not been permitted under former regulations. So this is a map. Before I move on, I wanted to show you guys this map. This is a map that I made the other day based on information from Avram Galante's 1937 booklet on the synagogues of Istanbul. I think it's a great way to illustrate the diversity of Jewish communities in the city. Every dot on this map indicates a place name that a synagogue in Istanbul was named after. So as Jewish communities from across Europe and Anatolia made their way to Istanbul, they often founded synagogues and named them after their city, town, or country of origin. So as you can see here, there were once many synagogues in Istanbul named after places in the Iberian Peninsula. There's one called the Portugal Synagogue. It no longer exists today. There was a Spanish synagogue, a Cordoban synagogue. There was a synagogue founded by Jews from the islands of Majorca, which still exists today, although it's quite derelict. It's in the neighborhood of Haskoy. It's called the Mayor Synagogue. But as you can imagine, there were once many, many synagogues in Istanbul, and these are just the ones that were named after specific geographical locations. Not every group of Jews who arrived in Istanbul had to name their synagogues after a certain place, but this just gives you an idea. And I'm sure no one is surprised about the abundance of Sephardic synagogues, but what I find particularly interesting is the number of synagogues that were named after places in Greece and the Balkans and other parts of Europe. This shows that the Jewish community was always much more diverse and pluralistic than we tend to think, with Romaniot and Ashkenazi communities living alongside the dominant Sephardic community. Jewish history in Turkey is often recounted with the year 1492 as a starting point. This flawed historiographical approach centers the narrative of Turkish Jewish history on the expulsion of Sephardic Jews from Spain and Portugal and their eventual migration to the Ottoman Empire. However, this approach overlooks the reality that Jewish communities were present in Anatolia and present-day Istanbul well before 1492. The reality is that Ashkenazi migration in the Ottoman Empire predates Sephardic migration. So here's an interesting picture from the Beit Tutsot archives I think it's actually part of the permanent exhibition there in Tel Aviv in the Museum of the Jewish Diaspora. It's a Jewish family in Izmir that celebrates the Sabbath with a Jewish refugee who escaped the Chmielniki pogroms in Poland in the 17th century. I think it's a very interesting image. And throughout the centuries, there was a steady influx of Ashkenazi Jews who settled in parts of the Ottoman Empire. This reached a peak in the 19th and 20th centuries when the Ashkenazi population of Istanbul reached around 10,000 in the year 1915. So this is an interesting picture. It's two Ashkenazi students of law at the University of Istanbul in 1912, so in the period when there were about 10,000 Ashkenazi Jews living in Istanbul. I'm not sure if any of you can unmute, but do any of you have a guess of who these two students are? Okay, I'm not sure if you can unmute, but on the left, it's David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first president. And on the right, it's Yitzhak Ben-Zvi, who was Israel's second president. And both of them were students of law at one point at the University of Istanbul. One of the reasons why Ashkenazi Jews, fleeing persecution and pogroms in Eastern Europe, were quick to embrace the Ottoman Empire as a home was because Ottoman law at the time enabled migrants to gain citizenship rights after 5 years of residency. As such, many of these Ashkenazi Jews quickly became Ottoman citizens and established communities in Istanbul, using their extended citizenship rights to construct synagogues in neighborhoods such as Galata, but also elsewhere in the city and also elsewhere in the empire. There was also a small Ashkenazi community in Salonika and a small Ashkenazi community in Izmir. Furthermore, the arrival of Ashkenazi Jews in the 19th century facilitated the development and consolidation of the Ottoman capitalist economy and financial system. The Ashkenazi communities in the empire maintained positive relations with the Sultan in parallel to the already existing Sephardic communities. So moving on to the case study that I'll be talking about today, I'll be focusing on the three Ashkenazi synagogues of Galata. This neighborhood, Galata, on the European side of Istanbul, located across the Golden Horn from the historical peninsula, was once a Genoese colony. It is an architecturally and culturally rich quarter of the city and is home to numerous churches, synagogues, European-style hospitals, grand apartment buildings, and the world's second oldest underground railway system, referred to as the Tünel in Turkish. The neighborhood centers around the famous Galata Tower, as you can see here, which is referred to by the city's Jews as La Kula, which is a Ladino word meaning the tower, from the Turkish word kule. So Galata was home to a burgeoning and lively Jewish community in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Sephardic and Ashkenazi Jews from older neighborhoods in the city, traditionally known for their large Jewish populations, such as Balat, Haskoy, and Kuzgunjuk, began to move to Galata, preferring its more modern and more Western character. As a result of the large Jewish influx into Galata, many synagogues were constructed in and around the district. And in its heyday, there were at least 7 active synagogues in Galata, 4 Sephardic and 3 Ashkenazi. So as you can see in this great map from Royce Ojalvo Kamayor's book, The yellow districts here, the parts of Istanbul highlighted in yellow, by the way, for those who are not very familiar with Istanbul, this side here is the European side of the city, and this side on the right is the Asian side of the city. The peninsula down here is the historical peninsula, and this is the Golden Horn that separates the historical peninsula from Galata. So traditional areas of Jewish settlement in Istanbul were Eminönü, Balat, Hasköy, Ortaköy, and Kuzguncuk. But then later, destinations that were popular from the 1880s to the 1940s were places such as Galata and Kadıköy. Later on, from 1930 to 1965, destinations such as Şişli, Nişantaşı, and Göztepe became more popular, the red ones. And then from 1965 to present, newer neighborhoods such as Kemerburgaz and Göktürk became popular for Jewish settlement. So this is another map of the synagogues of Galata. They're all located in very close proximity to each other, as you can see. The Zulfaris, the Schneider Temple, the Grand Ashkenazi Synagogue, the Or Hadash, the Italian Synagogue, and the Neve Shalom. I'm going to be talking briefly about each of them, first starting with the Sephardic ones, giving you a brief introduction about them, before moving on to the actual case study, which is the Ashkenazi synagogues. So the Zulfaris Synagogue, or also known as the Kal Kadosh Galata, many of you have probably heard of this synagogue since it served as the home for the Jewish Museum of Turkey for many years, before the museum moved to its newer and bigger location by the Neve Shalom Synagogue. The Zulfaris Synagogue was most probably built in the 17th century, but it was reconstructed in its current form in 1890. Today it serves as a cultural venue, and it's rented out by a private company, as far as I know. The Apollon, or the Knesset Israel Synagogue, was built in 1923 and was one of the biggest and most frequented in the city, but it shut down in 1982 following the construction of the nearby Neve Shalom and disagreements with the landlords or something. Its Torah Ark can still be seen today in the Jewish Museum of Turkey. Nearby is the Italian synagogue, also known as the Cal de los Francos. Francos is a word that refers to, it's also used in Turkish and Ottoman Turkish specifically, refers to broadly Europeans. It's a Sephardic synagogue, but it was founded by a particular community of Sephardic Jews who had connections to the Italian state. This beautiful little synagogue is located on Serderi Ekrem Street, and it has a beautiful ornate interior. It's still used today actively, and it's also occasionally home to concerts and small musical recitals. The Neve Shalom Synagogue is nowadays probably the most famous synagogue in Istanbul. It's also the biggest in Istanbul, but not the biggest in Turkey. It is used by the community frequently for large celebrations such as weddings and bat or bar mitzvahs. Unfortunately, as it's the city's most well-known synagogue, the building was subject to multiple terrorist attacks in the past, having been attacked in 1986 and 2003. As you can see here, there's a memorial in the interior for victims of the 1986 attack and victims of the 2003 attack. And a certain part of the interior was not restored following the attack to serve as a reminder of those attacks. The current Jewish Museum of Turkey is now located in the buildings adjacent to the Neve Shalom, and you can easily visit the synagogue whilst visiting the museum. Of course, Jewish heritage in Galata and in Istanbul is so much more than just synagogues, so I wanted to add a few more things from the neighborhood of Galata. On the left, you can see the Komondo steps, which link the upper and the lower parts of Galata. They were built by a wealthy family called the Komondo family, and they're very scenic. It's a great place where people are always taking Instagram pictures. And on the right, it's just a picture of the Jewish Museum of Turkey, which is now located by the Neve Shalom Synagogue. So moving on to the three Ashkenazi synagogues of Istanbul, I'm going to start by discussing a little bit about each one. The one on the going from left to right, it's the Grand Ashkenazi Synagogue, also referred to as the Austrian Temple. Today I'll be referring to it mostly as the Austrian Temple to distinguish it from the other Ashkenazi synagogues. The one in the middle is the Tailor's Synagogue, known by its Yiddish name, the Schneider Temple. And on the right is the Or Hadash Synagogue. So the Austrian Temple, the synagogue was built with the support of financial contributions made by Austrian Jews and was opened in a grand ceremony in the year 1900. The opening ceremony was marked by the attendance and remarks of the Austro-Hungarian ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, representing the importance and significance of the synagogue for the upper echelons of Ashkenazi society in Istanbul at the time. Today, the Austrian Temple remains resolute, standing proudly on Yüksek Kaldırım Street, seen and pictured on a daily basis by locals and tourists alike. Its symbolic dome supports a long spire topped by a little Star of David as an outward sign defining the building as a Jewish house of worship. It is the only active Ashkenazi synagogue in the whole of Turkey, serving what's left of a very tiny community. So here are some pictures. This is its front facade. As you can see, it has these horseshoe domes as well as a big dome in the interior. This is its view from behind. You can see it from the Golden Horn and from other parts of Istanbul. You can see the dome, the Star of David on top. This is a dedication plaque inside. It says, built to commemorate the 50th, I have to move this out of the way, the 50th anniversary of our glorious monarch's reign, of His Majesty the Emperor and King Franz Joseph I, the Kaisers and Königs, the King and the Emperor, Constantinople, 1900, the German-Austrian Israelite community. This is a picture of the interior. The Torah Ark is very ornate and is, I read once that it's supposed to represent one of the gates to Jerusalem. Here are two more pictures of the interior. The synagogue has two women's galleries, as well as a beautiful dome. This is the picture of the dome from the inside. So nearby, on a comparatively quiet side street, stands the Schneider Temple Art Center, or the Tofrei Begadim Synagogue, the Tailors Synagogue, depending on what you want to call it, what language you want to speak. It's a Jewish-themed cultural space housed in a former Ashkenazi synagogue. As hinted by its Yiddish name, the synagogue once served the Jewish tailors of Ashkenazi origin who worked and traded in and around the district of Galata. The Schneider Temple was commissioned by a guild of Ashkenazi tailors and was subsequently opened to worship in 1894. It continued to serve as a place of worship until the late 20th century, when the dwindling Ashkenazi community in Istanbul decided to convert it into an art center. It has thus been serving in this capacity since 1998, featuring temporary exhibitions as well as permanent displays on the history of Ashkenazim in Turkey. Despite the hardships faced by the administration of Istanbul's Ashkenazi foundations, the Schneider Temple was successfully converted into a heritage site that is regularly featured in Istanbul guidebooks and is a frequently visited spot on tours that take place in this quarter of the city. So as you can see, it has a rather ornate facade. It's definitely a post-Tanzimat era synagogue, as it has very clear Jewish symbols on its entrance, Hebrew written out. It's not covered or surrounded by high walls. Here are some pictures of the interior. The upper galleries are reserved for the permanent exhibition on Ashkenazim in Turkey, and the lower prayer hall, the former prayer hall, is where there's temporary exhibitions, usually art exhibitions, sometimes caricatures and other things. And here is a poster of the permanent exhibition, a brief history of the Ashkenazi community in Turkey, a living archive. It's definitely well worth visiting. Also, their website is worth visiting. I can send a link to anyone who is interested. So finally, on a steep alleyway on Zürafa Street, just around the corner from the Austrian temple and just 2 minutes away from the Schneider Temple, stand the remains of the Or Hadash synagogue. Or Hadash means new light in Hebrew. The derelict condition of the synagogue must not be exclusively attributed to the general state of the diminished Ashkenazi community in Turkey today, but also to the social and economic factors that fuel both the processes of heritagization as well as the production of history. I first came across the Or Hadash in an obscure article I read while I was doing research for my bachelor's thesis in May 2019. Prior to that moment, I had never heard of the existence of such a place in a seemingly bustling part of the city. In fact, the informational brochures given out at the Austrian temple don't even mention the existence of the Or Hadash. I found it hard to comprehend how such an important structure, attesting to the social memory and history of Galata, could be in such a ruined condition, considering the importance and affluence of Galata as a major cultural and touristic hotspot in Istanbul. I soon discovered that the Or Hadash was not frequented by the wealthier congregation of the Austrian temple, nor by the tailors and guildsmen of the Schneider Temple. Rather, the Or Hadash was constructed to serve the religious needs of the Ashkenazi community's socially and economically disadvantaged members. Tucked away from the prominence of the bustling Yüksek Kaldırım Street, an important part of the Or Hadash congregation was made up of women who worked as prostitutes in the surrounding brothels. Furthermore, the synagogue building also housed a home for the sick and elderly, a Moshav Zkenim, and served as a safe haven for disenfranchised members of the Jewish community. This was the case throughout much of the building's active history until it fell into disuse and disrepair and was eventually sold off in 1987. So overall, the question remains, why is it that the Austrian temple and the Schneider temple have made it onto Istanbul's heritage map, whereas the Or Hadash has been forgotten about and condemned to collective amnesia? Why is it that the Or Hadash is all too often excluded from public memory and written memoirs, as well as from official historiography and written accounts on Istanbul's Jewish heritage? Before moving on, I'm just going to show a couple more pictures of the Or Hadash. So as you can see, its roof has collapsed. I don't know when, but it's been quite a while, I think. I have never been able to find older pictures of this place in any archive or in any photo collection. This is a view from the side. There are now trees growing in the middle. From behind, you can see where the Torah Ark was probably, the niche where the Torah Ark was probably located on the inside, as the bottom floor was used as an old people's home and a place for the sick, while the top floor was the synagogue. Here are some more pictures. At the very entrance, you can see it's hard to read and I can't make out any letters, but there is some Hebrew written in the entrance. And this is a general image of the synagogue on Zurafa Street, the Or Hadash. So one key answer to the questions I just posed is that differences in intra-community economic class and social status that were apparent in the early 20th century persist and dominate in the process of cultural heritage creation in the present day. This can clearly be seen in the historiography of Ashkenazi history and heritage in Istanbul, where once more class, gender, and social status have been key determinants of what is deemed worthy to maintain, preserve, and heritagize. The present-day condition of Galata's 3 Ashkenazi synagogues surely confirm this point. Most of the books or articles I've read about the history, culture, and society of Turkish Jews will surely mention the iconic Austrian temple, which stands mighty and proud as perhaps Istanbul's most famous Jewish landmark. Similarly, the Schneider temple nearby also tends to get a mention, but the Or Hadash has somehow been forgotten. So as you can see in this chart, the Austrian temple served members of the Ashkenazi community who were seen as the elite, the aristocracy. They had a higher socioeconomic background, and today the synagogue is actively used as a synagogue. The Schneider temple was used by working class, a guild of Ashkenazi tailors, the mercantile class, and it has been converted into an art center. The Or Hadash, which was home to the disenfranchised, to women, to prostitutes, and to the elderly, has been abandoned since 1987. So the production of history is strictly political. There are very clear power relations that inform what does and what does not get recorded in historical accounts. In this sense, it remains true that an overwhelming amount of the historical accounts that we have access to were written by not only men, but also wealthier, educated, and privileged men. The complex history of subaltern groups, that is, disenfranchised groups or individuals such as women, such as the poor, the LGBT community, ethnic and religious minorities, prostitutes, the elderly, and children, is very often absent from history books. The story of the Or Hadash demonstrates the continuity and persistence of historic class divides in the making of cultural heritage sites. The Or Hadash was not deemed worthy of being recorded and remembered as its neighboring synagogues were. So consequently, Jewish heritage tours will often ignore the derelict Or Hadash as it continues to crumble year by year. But who were the women who came to the synagogue? In what language or in what languages did they pray? Where are their descendants today? How many weddings took place here? What were the relations between the members of the different Ashkenazi congregations in Galata like? Answers to these questions are all hindered by the continued disregard for the history of the women and the socioeconomically disenfranchised who made up the congregation of the Or Hadash. As such, the recorded history of Turkish Jewry loses touch with its diverse and pluralistic historical elements. So coming back, here's an image. As you can see here on the left, that's the Austrian temple. Just around the corner on Zürafa Sokak, that is the Or Hadash as seen from Karaköy, with the Galata Tower in the background. So coming back to the Galata Tower, coming back to La Kula, the Galata Tower has cast its shadow over the Or Hadash for many, many decades. Processes of heritagization and tourism have come together to put the surrounding synagogues on Istanbul's heritage map. The importance, wealth, and social standing of the congregants at the time of construction have ensured that the Austrian temple and Schneider temple be remembered and preserved, whilst the Or Hadash remains derelict and crumbling. One can only hope that through increased efforts and activism, the Or Hadash will be saved from complete collapse. A comprehensive restoration of the synagogue could in turn shine new light on not only the overall history of the Ashkenazim in Istanbul, but also on the women, the elderly, and the poor, who have too often been excluded from the scope of historical books and articles. So one question that I had for myself myself when I first discovered the existence of the synagogue was, what can I do as just an individual student? What I did in the end was add the Or Hadash to Google Maps as a location to physically put it on the map. I wrote a review, and every once in a while I get notifications on the amounts of views on the amounts of clicks that the location tag has received on Google Maps. Up until today, it's received more than 40,000, which is good because people who are traveling around just checking Google Maps realize that this place exists, and many of them come and check it out, which is good because the least we can do, a good place to begin, is always to raise awareness on the existence of these vulnerable cultural heritage sites. Secondly, I did what I could do in terms of speaking about it and writing about it. So I wrote articles about the Or Hadash in Turkish, in Ladino, and in English, and they were published in various different places. And yeah, that is the end of my presentation for today. These are my contact details. If anyone is interested in emailing me or asking any questions, they can email me on kenancruz@gmail.com. My Twitter address is kenancruz, @kenancruz. You can also visit my personal blog, kenancruzchile.wordpress.com. And I also run a page on Instagram called Turkey Heritage Watch, where I share pictures of multicultural Armenian, Greek, Jewish heritage sites in Turkey, most of which are vulnerable, some of which have been preserved and restored, but it's a platform in which I share these things. So yeah, I'd be happy to take any questions if anyone has any questions on their mind.
Thank you so much, Kenan. As we say in Hebrew, also in Sephardic community, on a fantastic part one and a three-part series. We'll take some questions now. If you have any questions, we ask if you enter them to the chat, and we'll read them out and try to get to as many as we can in the remaining time. We already have a few already. So first question here, let's see. Someone asked, you referenced Ashkenazi immigration and that it predates Sephardic immigration. Would you expand on the statement and explain the history of the specifically Ashkenazic arrival versus Sephardic and Romaniote as well, which you mentioned, the Judeo-Greek?
Yes, so Romaniote Jews can be seen as the local Jews. They predate even the existence of the Byzantine Empire, as far as I know. But Ashkenazi Jews, there's evidence of Ashkenazi Jews coming to cities such as Edirne before 1492, in the 13th century and 14th century. So although we mostly tend to associate Ashkenazim in the Ottoman Empire and Turkey with the influx of Ashkenazim from the 19th and 18th centuries, and also during the early 1930s, when many Jews fled from countries such as Germany to work in the Republic of Turkey and to found certain parts of universities, faculties, and whatever. That does not mean that that's the only part of Ashkenazi history in Turkey. There's not much research done on the previous communities and on the impacts that Sephardic demographic dominance had on the two communities, on Romaniote and Ashkenazi Jews. But the history of Ashkenazim definitely goes much further back than just the 18th and 19th centuries.
Another question here. Questions about the Yambol and Ahrida synagogues that are both historically important, and maybe you can speak a little bit about their historical restoration by the Centennial Foundation in the 90s.
Yes, so the Yambol and Ahrida synagogues are located in Balat. They're both sites of memory, named after synagogues that were on the map, Abraham Galante's map. Yambol was named after a city, I believe a town in Bulgaria, and Ahrida, Ohri, which is in modern-day Macedonia. The two synagogues were originally Romaniote synagogues, but later, with the dominance of Sephardic culture, they eventually came into the hands of the Sephardic community and are today both active synagogues, although there's very little Sephardic presence or Jewish presence in Balat today. I believe congregants whose families used to go to these two synagogues still return for high holidays and on the Shabbat. The restoration of the Ahrida synagogue in the lead up to 1992 by the Quincentennial Foundation was very controversial because oftentimes restorations seek to capture an image of a perfect moment. And Meltem Özkan actually has a great article about this. And the Ahrida synagogue was reimagined as a Sephardic synagogue. And there was this whole idea that was created around the idea that this is a Sephardic synagogue, even though it predates the Sephardic arrival, and it's actually a synagogue that existed before even the capturing of Constantinople by Fatih Sultan Mehmet the Conqueror. So what's interesting is that it was reimagined as a Sephardic synagogue, sort of a process of myth making was involved in this, where the bima in the middle, the teva, was decided to be in the shape of a galley that brought the Jews from Spain and Portugal to the Ottoman Empire, even though there's no proof of that being the reason why it's shaped in the way that it's shaped. So there was a lot of myth making involved, and certain parts of the synagogue were knocked down and destroyed during the restoration to sort of make the synagogue look like a classical Ottoman artifact, when in fact it predates even the Ottomans, if I'm not mistaken. And I also believe that the Gniza at the synagogue was not deemed worthy of preservation. So many documents that were stored in there for perhaps hundreds of years were just disposed of and thrown away. So the restoration is quite controversial. And when I visited the Ahrida and the Yanbol synagogues, the wonderful gentleman that was giving me a tour, that was showing me around, said that the congregants actually much prefer the nearby Yanbol because it hasn't been touched by the forces of conservation. It hasn't been transformed from its original function. Yeah.
Another question here. Thank you so much for the rich presentation. She's interested in the formal legal status of these sites. Were the waqfs in Ottoman time? Were they waqfs? Sorry, W-A-Q-F-S. Sorry, I can't pronounce it quite so well. When and how did they transition into the contemporary legal entities? And might that also partly explain the differential status of property and decline today?
That's a very good question. I'm not too much of an expert on the whole concept of vakıfs, as we call them in Turkish. I believe that there are several different vakıfs that administer the synagogues in Istanbul. The Ashkenazi community has its own vakıf, known as the Ashkenazi vakıf, Istanbul Ashkenaz Vakfı, I believe, the Ashkenazi vakıf of Istanbul, and they administer the Schneider Temple as well as the Grand Austrian Temple. The Schneider Temple is also home to the community's offices, the vakıf's offices. And I believe in 1987, it must have been the Ashkenazi vakıf that sold the Orhadash, although I could be mistaken. But I don't know too much about the history of vakıfs and when they were founded, and I don't want to give an incorrect explanation. So I could definitely look that up and get back to you.
Was there ever any relationship between the Jewish communities in Istanbul, Izmir, and other Jewish communities throughout the present-day Turkey, with the communities in Antakya, Antioch, and Ankara, etc.? And how do they relate each other when it came to preserving their physical?
That's also a great question. So Ankara should be distinguished from Antakya and Gaziantep and Kilis and the other eastern communities, because the community in Ankara was indeed Sephardic. There are quite a few famous Turkish Jews who have roots in Ankara, such as the Alaton family. Ishak Alaton was a famous Turkish Jewish businessman. His family hailed from Ankara, and several travel articles and travel journals from the early 20th century and late 19th century mentioned that the Jews of Ankara used to speak a strange, corrupted Spanish. Interestingly, obviously they were referring to Ladino. The eastern communities in Antakya and beyond, further east, were not Sephardic. They were mostly Mizrahi, interestingly, and Arabic-speaking Jews. You can also tell because there's architectural distinction, that there's certain architectural elements that distinguish Mizrahi synagogues from the Ashkenazi and Sephardic synagogues of Western Turkey. I think the location of the Torah Ark, whereas in Sephardic synagogues they tend to be on the eastern side of the structure. In the synagogues of Antakya and Kilis and Gaziantep, I believe, so 3 Arabic-speaking community synagogues, the Torah Ark is located on the south side, on the south facade of the building. So there are certain distinctions, and I don't know how well interconnected these communities were. I do know that when Antakya and Gaziantep and Kilis, when the communities from those cities began to leave in the 20th century, some of them migrated to Israel and elsewhere abroad, but many of them did immigrate to Istanbul. So there must be many members of those communities in Istanbul today, or descendants.
Excellent. We have one comment here. Muchas gracias que hemos presidentes Kenan en persona.
Merci mucho.
So I think that's it for questions right now from people. I'm going to stop share just for a moment. But I want to thank Kenan for a wonderful first presentation. Inshallah, we'll be back here next week, 1:30 p.m. Eastern, 10:30 a.m. Pacific time. Please also, if you haven't subscribed to our newsletter, La Voz Sephardi, we send out announcements every week about different programs. So you can always check out La Voz Sephardi, subscribe on our website, SephardiCbrotherhood.com. And inshallah, we should see you all next week. Thank you so much, Kenan.
Thank you so much. Thanks. Thank you, everybody.